pleasure to welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome LUC NIJS and Melissa BREMMER to present their lecture entitled Pedagogies of the Possible meets Embodied Music Pedagogy. LUC NIJS is Associate Professor in Early Childhood Music Education and Head of the Bachelor in Music Education at the University of Luxembourg, and he is also Visiting Professor at Ghent University, affiliated to Systematic Museology Research Institute, and as a co-founder to the Joint Chair on Music Making and Social Action. His research integrates theory development, empirical studies and practice, focusing on the musician-instrument relationship, on the role of body movement in the instrumental learning processes, and on the role of technology in provoking an embodied approach to instrumental music education. Melissa BREMMER is Professor of Arts Education at the Amsterdam University of the Arts in the Netherlands. Her research focuses on embodied music pedagogy, music education and disability, and art science education. Currently, she is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Music in Early Childhood and has been a member of the Music in Special Education and Music Therapy Commission from 2018 to 2024. Together with Emily Heinen, she is the author of the book Wicked Art Assignment. So I know that many members of our network are big admirers of Luc's and Melissa's work, and I'm particularly grateful to Anastasia Vandan and to Pam Bernard from the University of Cambridge for suggesting this lecture and for bringing us closer together, for bringing the possibility studies and the music education closer together. So, and without any further delay, Luc, Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps, everyone. So welcome to this talk. I would like to thank, of course, Possibility Studies Network for the invitation. I think it's a real pleasure that we can do this and present our work in this community. And of course, also many thanks to Xenia for organizing everything until the last moment. All right. So we can skip, I think, the next, if it works, the next slide, as long as it wants to work. Okay, because you have introduced us so kindly, Xenia. So let's just start. And I'm trying to make it work. So here's just a little overview, makes it easy. We will talk about pedagogies of the possible, then we go to embodied music pedagogy, and we will focus on the one side on the learner, and then Melissa on the music teacher. So according to Glaveanu, and I hope I say your name right, I think is it okay? Because we were discussing it.
This is the network of the possible. There are many ways of saying it. In Romanian, it would be Glaveanu, but I am open to anything. So
okay, to Glaveanu. Okay, great. So pedagogies of the possible are an educational necessity to help students and teachers move beyond the world as it was and as it is, to imagine how it can and should be. And so this is a very interesting point of departure when thinking about music education, which has a strong tradition, the so-called conservatoire tradition, especially when we talk about instrumental music education, and this is what Melissa and I will mainly do. Now, before we dive into everything, we would like you to close your eyes for a moment and picture an instrument lesson. Try to picture the scenario as typically taking place in a music classroom. So let's close our eyes. Try to imagine it. Okay, so in the traditional Western music education system, a common scenario is, as you see here, you have the master, the teacher, who explains to the student, and the student tries to do what the teacher says. Prototypical pedagogical practices and traditions of music education often focus on standardized goals, uniformity in teaching, and sameness of outcomes. There is a transactional logic behind teaching, or as Beghetto and Glaveanu say, it involves giving something with the expectation of gaining something in return. And this approach often leads to a very repertoire-based approach to music learning, confirming the idea that the repertoire is the curriculum, in which gradually, for example, new content is added, such as notes, chords, scales, new playing techniques, tonalities, and styles that are introduced through the repertoire. Now here, you see a scenario as we envision as a possible future. Children moving around while playing, doing everything by ear instead of using scores, exploring and experimenting with music. And in the past years, Melissa and I have been imagining how what was and is in music education can become something else. Building on theories, research, and practice, we believe it should become something else and transform from traditional pedagogy into a pedagogy of the possible. And in our view, such a pedagogy builds on the fundamental role of the body in human interaction with music and in music learning. Embodied learning and teaching are issues that perhaps have not received sufficient attention, yet they matter because they address our fundamental way of being in the world and of interacting with others. Therefore, we develop a rationale for it, based on theories, research findings, and practice. The embodied music pedagogy is a way to take creative action and ensure positive, sustainable outcomes. In this talk, we will explain our rationale, illustrating how bodily interaction with music opens the door to the possible as a field of inquiry, inviting students to discover the multiplicity of musical possibilities. Next, we will give examples of what we imagine as positive and sustainable pedagogical activities. So the video you just saw is inspirational for our educational approach, embodied music pedagogy, that centers around bodily, expressive, and creative interaction with, in, and through music. In our view, embodied music pedagogy acknowledges the fundamental role of learners and teachers' physical and expressive interaction with music and with each other. It is developed for lessons in which communication through, with, and in sound and music is the dominant mode. This pedagogy is by nature multimodal, inviting musical engagement through all the senses, and it addresses pupils' sensory-motor, affective, creative, and cognitive resources. Through movement-based music activities, it seeks to deepen the prior musical knowledge of pupils and stimulate them to physically engage with each other in joint musical sense-making.
So the development of embodied music pedagogy is based on two pillars. A musicological one, namely the theory of embodied music cognition, and a pedagogical one, namely non-linear pedagogy. And we will start by taking a closer look at embodied music cognition, followed by a closer look at non-linear pedagogy.
So, embodied music cognition. Music learning is about making sense of music so we can understand it and communicate that understanding in an expressive and creative way. According to the theory of embodied music cognition, musical sense-making is the outcome of active bodily involvement with music, in which musical patterns are associated with movement patterns that allow us to discover intentional states. This is what Mark Lehmann calls enactment. To make this concrete, have a look at this figure. We hear music with the rhythm tam, ta-tam, 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 for example, and we could couple that to a hopping movement. My slides, my paper says do it, but it's not going to work.
We could invite everybody to do it just to experience it.
But this hopping movement is something that you would typically do when you are happy. So that's how we go from musical patterns to an intentional state, and in this case, an emotion. Also think back of the starting film. And so in embodied music pedagogy, we follow this reasoning and we use what Mark Lemon proposes as the basic mechanisms of this enactment process, being entrainment, prediction, and alignment. So let's dive a little deeper into these processes.
Now, a first basic mechanism is entrainment, and this is one of the most well-known mechanisms. Entrainment can be described as the coordination of temporally structured events through interaction. Now, entrainment can happen between people. For example, you will probably all recognize the following. Two people are walking together and automatically start walking in the same tempo. They synchronize their steps because they're unconsciously, they are pulled toward each other's tempo and eventually find and keep that tempo. Now, entrainment can happen between the heartbeats of people, but even between clocks. And entrainment in music happens when you are really pulled towards a certain beat in the music or to the beat of other musicians. And this entrainment really helps you to develop an underlying time framework. Even if the beat is not audible, people will still feel the underlying beat. Now let's watch a short movie that makes this very idea of entrainment clear. I hope that made it clear.
Yes. Okay, it stops already. So all the metronomes go together like when people are clapping. Okay, so a second mechanism is alignment. This basic mechanism concerns how we associate overt movement with music. Such overt musics are coupled and aligned to salient elements or events in the music. This could be the beat and the tempo. And when movements match the beat, so synchronize, it is called phase alignment. But we can also align to a musical event, let's say an increase in loudness, in music called crescendo, and the movement you make could follow the unfolding of the crescendo and end in a climax. Okay. So this is an example of interface alignment. And again, we have a little movie to show alignment.
Ram, make your work a pleasure. Move with the rhythm of music. Our next selection, Brahms' Hungarian Dance, number 5.
I think it is clear for everyone.
Right, so the third basic mechanism is prediction. Prediction in music is the ability to sense how the music will unfold in time. And a good example of this is that people usually sense when the music is going to end. And if you don't sense this, you kind of really have a problem. For example, you might keep playing a music improvisation while everybody already has stopped. Now, predicting music also depends on your perceptual abilities, your emotional state, and even the structure of your body. For instance, if you hear samba music for the first time, you might get really confused. Do you hear a double meter or a triple meter? And if you can't hear the meter of the music, it can be really difficult to predict the beat correctly. So taking a recurring movement, for example, 3 steps forward and 3 steps back, helps you to hear the music as a triple meter and to predict it as such. So prediction is related to the bodily experience. Movements provide a physical sensation of recurring patterns, helping to anticipate what comes next. Now, prediction is very interesting because composers tend to play with it. As such, music is a great playground to get used to the unexpected. And here's a movie showing prediction.
A famous one.
Talking about expectations. Watch. Ba, ba. Ba, 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 ba. Okay.
So now that we have addressed the musicological foundation of the embodied music pedagogy, we move on to the underlying pedagogical approach, namely nonlinear pedagogy. And the roots of this pedagogy lie in dynamical systems theory, also in ecological psychology, which is translated into the practice of teaching and learning using a constraints-led approach.
Now, in short, dynamical systems are systems where the whole is always more than the sum of its parts, based on the dynamic interaction between its components and between the components and the whole. Now think of a music performance, which forms a really complex dynamical system with its different components, such as the musician, the instrument, the audience, and the sounding music. Each individual component, but also the interaction between the components, determines the performance as a whole. For instance, the audience and the musicians form a coupled system. So when the audience reacts really enthusiastically, this will influence the way the musicians play, probably more vigorously.
And in the same way, we can conceive of an instrumental music lesson as a dynamical system, because lesson always involves the dynamic interaction between the teacher, the student, and the lesson content. And although we conceive of the teacher as part of the system during the actual pedagogical interaction, the teacher has the possibility to shape the interaction through the lesson design, including, for example, the pedagogical goals and the choice of material to achieve that goal. And this brings us to the constraints-led approach.
Now, a main idea of the constraints-led approach is that certain constraints are, as Glaveanu mentions, enablers of our relation with what is possible. By really narrowing down learners' choices through constraints, this paradoxically opens possibilities for them. Therefore, if chosen well, constraints can provide learners with some direction for their learning process without prescribing definite outcomes. Now, Newell distinguishes between three different constraints. One, individual constraints that relate to personal characteristics and are divided in structural or functional constraints. So structural constraints are constants, such as the size of the hand, which influences the way you can play chords on the piano. However, functional constraints can be changed or influenced by a teacher, such as motivation, fatigue, or concentration. Secondly, task constraints can be set by a teacher and include the goal of a specific task or providing feedback on the task during a learning experience. In instrumental lessons, for example, a teacher can task a learner to interpret a specific musical passage in different ways. Thirdly, environmental constraints refer to physical factors surrounding learners. Examples include the size of a space or the temperature or social factors such as peer groups. So again, within instrumental learning, environmental constraints are, for example, the acoustics of a room. Now here it is of interest to look at the relation between constraints on the one hand and affordances on the other. Affordances, in short, can be seen as the possibilities for action provided by the environment and that might be perceived by the student. Constraints can help to highlight certain relevant affordances and so create specific action possibilities within a musical activity. Now, through a constraint-led approach, learning can really emerge from the learner's goal-oriented, adaptive interactions in the learning environment. Let's have a look at an example of the constraint-led approach in action. Now, in this film, and it's typically Hollywood, so brace for the emotional music that will come with the film. But what you see is that the teacher has a specific goal in mind for the student. And therefore, the teacher provides two important constraints that help the student to flexibly find her own movement solution through adaptive interactions with the learning environment and to develop a certain skill. So my question to you is, what are the two constraints that the teacher uses?
And ring the bell.
Why?
Just do it.
You don't want me to dance?
No talking. Jump and ring the bell. Again.
You said we were going to train.
This is it. Again. Khaleesi, you lack precision and finesse. You have little or no sense of rhythm. You're without balance, grace, and charm.
Come on, you can't tell all that from one jump, can you? You can.
On the good side, you have the energy of a bullet. But you also have the lightness of a depressed elephant.
Hey! Laurent used exactly the same phrase.
After 10 years of cleaning, you pick stuff up. Okay, now jump up, ring this bell, land, and do not splash the water.
But that's impossible.
I thought it was your dream to dance.
Okay. Come on.
You're so unfair to yourself. Got that feeling in your chest. Can't look in the mirror.
Get lost.
Can't see who
Get lost! Shoot! Shoot!
wanna be somebody else. Every time you falter, every time you fall, I can still see the road ahead. You're brighter than the stars, and you'll see how radiant you are. I know you're full down, but don't let them bring you down, 'cause you're unstoppable.
Well, I think that is actually the highlight of our lecture, if you listen to the music. But probably both of you of all of you will have figured out that the bell and the water are the constraints that invite the learner to find her own movement action.
Okay, so to summarize for now, embodied music pedagogy addresses students' sensory, motor, affective, creative, and cognitive resources. It seeks to deepen the prior musical knowledge through movement-based music activities and stimulates joint musical sense-making. It invites and challenges to physically experience and explore new musical worlds. And this pedagogy embraces a constraints-led approach in which students develop through relations with each other, materials, and the environment to find new possibilities and grow as a musician. Constraints disclose new affordances and become opportunities for learning. So in sum, we could say that the embodied music pedagogy operationalizes a pedagogy of the possible by creating bodily, relational, and exploratory conditions in which learners can sense, explore, and realize new musical and personal possibilities.
So now that we have presented our embodied music pedagogy and its underlying theories, we would like to connect it to creativity. Creativity has been defined in many different ways. I don't think I need to tell all of you out there. But according to Withagen and van der Kamp, these different viewpoints have a similar underlying logic. Creativity is the idea starts with a novel idea in the head, and the head instructs the body to impose the novel form on material, and consequently, the process of creating does not shape the creativity process. In contrast, according to Glaveanu, creativity, rather than being something that resides in the individual mind, exists in the dynamic unfolding of the action, that is, through the interplay of movement and information, and is relational, that is, it simultaneously depends on individual abilities and on the social and material world. Now, Ken Robinson argued that schools often undermine creativity by focusing too much on children's heads rather than on their bodies. And while Robinson's view is critiqued, his ideas about creativity in schools do seem to extend to music schools that tend to emphasize technical skills and score analysis over creativity and expressiveness. And this, as Luc already mentioned in the beginning, leads to a very repertoire-based linear approach to music learning, confirming that the idea that repertoire is the curriculum in which gradually, for example, new playing techniques are introduced. However, embodied music pedagogy embraces non-linearity, embodied collaboration, and experimentation, trying to shape the process of emergent and self-organized learning through the use of constraints. Now, in our view, such an approach fosters the development of creativity rather than in reinforcing the focus on technique and the imitation of the music teacher. Now, to make this clear in what's next, we would like to share with you a somewhat speculative view on creativity that creates embodied learning to the dynamical systems theory.
So here's the rationale behind this speculation is that music is an affordance-laden structure, and creativity is about navigating and responding to a rich but complex landscape of musical affordances. And this can be scaffolded by different constraints. The openness, specification, selection, and flexible enaction of competing affordances requires first being in a metastable zone and second cognitive flexibility. An embodied process of musical sense-making, so enactment, and its basic mechanisms, entrainment, prediction, and alignment, support the flexible navigation of the musical affordance landscape. And I will now go briefly deeper into some aspects of this speculation. The full paper is published in the Creativity Research Journal and available open access. So let me first talk some more about affordances. Many definitions have been given. You all know that in the domain of music, Kruger, for example, defines it as follows. Affordances are those aspects of music that define what we can do with it. In my own view, I see musical affordances as invitations to enact the music, referring to Mark Lemann's concept of enactment. And on the one hand, affordances relate to specific elements in the music. On the other hand, they relate to the learner's abilities to perceive and respond to these elements, whether you are playing music, dancing to it, or just listening to it. And I emphasize the doing here. What is at stake is the connection between patterns in the sound and patterns in responsive behavior. And we all know music can be very complex, having patterns at different layers that enable different response patterns. And this gives rise to a multiplicity of affordances. Importantly, while some affordances are clear and obvious, others are more hidden. For example, when listening to the music of Bach, people are inclined to listen to the melody. However, very interesting and expressive events often in other voices. And again, Glaveanu says, creativity is the process of perceiving, exploiting, and generating novel affordances. Getting a grip on the multitude of affordances is all about the so-called navigating the musical environment. With Rijboek and others, I consider music as a kind of environment or a virtual space in which you can wander. Think of walking in a landscape during your holidays. You can do that in different ways. You can follow a predefined path, or you can just wander, being open to whatever comes to you, so that your path is ever changing. And imagine if you would run or walk, just step or do it on your knees, or when you're in a hurry because it's getting dark, you would see the landscape in even more different ways. Several factors define or determine the process of navigating the musical affordance landscape. First, through exploration and experimentation, hidden or new affordances can be discovered. However, affordances may remain unexploited because of, for example, existing norms such as cultural or professional or individual choices. Second, the perceptibility of affordances can be linked to the skills of the perceiver. Here we talk of an optimal grip on the environment as skilled intentionality that determines which affordances will stand out in the landscape. And finally, an individual's responsiveness to affordances is influenced by their past experience, habits, familiarity, and socio-cultural environment. Creativity can be seen as being based on the navigation of the musical landscape with an openness to different options. Such a state in which different options are possible is called the metastable state. Metastability not only allows flexible switching between actions, but also context-sensitive, selective openness. And to achieve such a state, or to be in a metastable zone, requires cognitive flexibility, which has previously been linked to creativity. Cognitive flexibility can be understood as shifting or thinking outside the box, seeing something from different perspectives, and quickly and flexibly adapting to changing circumstances. Now here, perhaps we cannot go too deep into it, but I might refer to a paper that I've written together with Noemi Greenspan and Sandra Fortuna on this.
So when teachers want to support creativity, they need to create conditions in which creativity can flourish, such as creating conditions for students to explore and experiment in a safe space, to find their own music movement associations, but at the same time stimulate them to respond to different elements in the music by stimulating an openness to the multitude of affordances in the music through the use of constraints. We believe moving to music is a way of creating a metastable stone in which students are confronted with competing affordances and with different options to respond to. Moving in different ways to music helps students to navigate the musical affordance landscape and to find new affordances. So we believe that the way we navigate the musical landscape and the affordances we perceive can be strongly influenced by the constraints that the music teacher places on the students. For instance, if the constraint is walking to the beat of the music, our attention will be drawn to the pulse of the music. However, when the constraint is to fluently move to the melody of that same music, our attention will be drawn to that element.
Lots of theory, perhaps time to go to practice. And based on this general framework of embodied music pedagogy and on my work on the musician-instrument relationship, I develop a research-based approach to instrumental music teaching, in which I reconsider the role of the body and body movement in learning how to play an instrument and develop an education of the body that goes beyond the mere instrumentalist approach to body and musical instrument. I call this a kinemusical approach. I see that somebody has, okay, good. So here you can see, if it works, the premises of the approach. The first premise of the approach is to develop the inner musician by stimulating internalization through movement in various spaces, such as the space in which you can walk, so locomotor activities, the space that is reachable, the personal space, when we stand still, yeah? And then the body itself. The second premise is that I take an integrative approach where movement activities primarily involve playing the instrument, in contrast to, for example, a Dalcroze approach where you first move without the instrument and then you go to the instrument. I try to work bottom up, so encouraging a lot of exploration and experimentation with music and movement associations, gradually increasing, gradually increasing the complexity of the task. So the idea is not to have choreographies, for example, that I make and then have the students do them. So we go always from simple to complex. That might seem linear, but it's not. You can also be non-linear even when going from simple to complex. But increasing the complexity of the task relates also to the proximal processes of Bronfenbrenner, for example. And so finally, movement-based activities can also train the performing body, such as loosening freedom of the joints, for example. We know that a lot of musicians develop problems in their body. Now, to make this concrete, I show you here some pictures from a study I conducted in 2021-2022, teaching 6 5-year-old children to play the dude. That's a small child-friendly version of the clarinet. Analysis is still ongoing, actually. Yes, but you see me and my students doing activities with and without the instrument. Sometimes we prepare an activity with the instrument by a movement activity without the instrument. This is interesting. You see, we always have to keep the possible. I want to do everything with the instrument, but when you do it, you see that sometimes you have to switch. The use of many materials and finding different possibilities, for example, a rope versus a stick, or pads and pads on the floor, they all are used to prepare alternative notation, for example, that then prepares traditional notation. So here I connect to Bruno. Now, to design the activities, I translated the theoretical framework of embodied music pedagogy into practices by establishing a framework of design prompts. You can see them as guiding principles that help me to design activities and observe and reflect on what I do. They also help me to be flexible when I need to make changes on the spot while teaching. And finally, they support me in imagining new activities and make my teaching creative. I want to emphasize that this framework of design prompts helps me to diversify the learning process as much as possible, creating different sets of individual task and environmental constraints to allow self-organized and emergent learning. And perhaps it's important here, I was not going to improvise, Melissa, but sometimes you just have to. I really like the idea of emergence because it's there where the interaction between different components actually plays such an important role. It's not the individual behavior, but it's how everything works together. And that is something that really happens in such a learning context. But here you see different of these prompts. For example, social and spatial choreographies can be used as environmental constraints, musical activities and social interaction as task constraints, and spaces as individual constraints. Now, how does this all link to creativity? I'm afraid I have to be a bit speculative, as I did not yet do empirical work on this. It's coming, yes, but it's important to say this, I think. So the kinemamusical approach introduces task constraints and manipulates individual constraints, thereby urging the musician to find a new balance, trying to keep the balance with the instrument while trying to match extra instrumental gestures to the played music. This is really negotiation. I want to move in a certain way to the music, but I have to play my instrument to make that music. So you have to negotiate between everything that is going on. But in doing so, it stimulates navigation of the affordance landscape, of yourself, of your instrument, and of course the music. In other words, a kinemamusical improvisation builds on the stable relationship that the musician has built with the instrument, but allows many possibilities, both in the music playing and in the movements you make to that music. According to Rovsky, it's difficult, and colleagues, multiple possible solutions are always needed for innovative behaviors. And it also requires flexibility to deal with the different options and adaptability to find a kinemamusical solution that match the individual constraints. And finally, through the manipulation of constraints based on the kinemamusical tasks, musicians are invited to shift between different options and perspectives, and they need to make decisions on what to do.
Right, until now we have looked at the perspective of the learner, and now we will change the perspective to the teacher. Now, music is always in the process of becoming, and performance always involves the unexpected. And due to this unpredictable nature of music, we believe that musical creativity is not confined to improvisation and composition, but also includes performing music. As such, creativity plays a part in instrumental and vocal music lessons, as music students really learn to creatively and expressively interpret music. Interestingly, research on general classroom music education suggests that the teacher's bodily involvement might scaffold and support creative music processes. So this made us think, can instrumental and vocal music teachers enhance the creativity and expressiveness of students through their bodily engagement? Can they provide the what is of music education with new perspectives for and in performance? Now, as we mentioned earlier, instrumental and vocal music teachers still seem to emphasize score analysis and technique. So this might be the reason that there's little research on how music teachers can stimulate and promote creativity through their bodily engagement. But let's look from a constraint-led music approach. Music teachers introduce students to constraints through their bodily involvement, through pedagogical gestures and pedagogical touch, for example. So we will hypothesize how these bodily strategies might scaffold creativity by creating ongoing possibilities for performance. So, music teachers commonly employ pedagogical gestures that intuitively accompany speech or music making to support the learning process. And gestures have that wonderful ability to make the invisible visible and to provide the music student with additional information next to musical and verbal information. Now, interestingly, pedagogical gestures in instrumental and vocal lessons do not necessarily need to be imitated, but they offer a new or additional perspective that might be explored. For instance, gestures can communicate technical information. For example, gestures can visualize a tongue position or demonstrate a resonance space. But gestures can also visualize musical information. Gestures can visualize the beat, for example, or the pitch of the contour of a melody. And they can also communicate expressive information, a change in loudness, or the quality of attack or release, or articulation and phrasing. So let's look at the constraints and affordances again. Now, the teacher's expressive gestures, a constraint, direct the learner's attention to less familiar expressive aspects in the music, to musical affordances that might have gone unnoticed before. And this relates to what Luc said before, that the student's attention gets attracted through the constraint to less obvious affordances, offering a new perspective, a new possibility to perform music. As such, the teacher's gestures might change the way students listen to music, offering them opportunities to rework the sound itself, and that might lead to novel and unknown interpretations of the music, really transforming the way students experience the music. And this new interpretation might then again elicit new gestures from the teachers. That again changes the way students experience music, and as such, a musical embodied dialogue between teacher and student can deepen interpretations. Now, another bodily teaching strategy is haptic feedback, also called pedagogical touch. And that revolves around manipulating the learner's body. And that can be viewed as a constraint too. Again, we hypothesize that touch might be an entry point to facilitate the student's sense of bodily flexibility and freedom. Now, important with this strategy is that teachers must always understand the ethical limits of physical contact as a pedagogical approach. So if applied, pedagogical touch should always be done in a professional, appropriate, non-threatening way based on mutual trust and on a voluntary basis. Therefore, students should always provide verbal consent. So through touch, the constraint, the teacher introduces the student to novel movements. And to exemplify that, we would like to draw on some very preliminary findings of our ongoing research that Luc and I are doing on pedagogical touch in singing lessons. Now, one teacher in that research notes, when you sing, you know your body in a certain way, right? But of course, there are just blind spots in your perception. There are areas of the body that you can feel easily. There are areas you feel less well, or even areas you don't feel or perceive at all, right? And then I have to awaken those areas by doing the manipulation. So with the help of touch, the student can freely explore new movements and physical sensations, possibly leading to new interpretations. Again, another citation from our ongoing research where a teacher notes, through touch, things happen that you don't completely anticipate. You sometimes get little surprises in the sound of the voice. So by helping the student feel a greater sense of bodily flexibility or freedom, we believe that the students have more possibilities to express themselves in unknown ways, which also might allow them to take a risk when they are performing music and to navigate the musical landscape in an open way.
Coming almost to the end, I think it is important, or we think it is important to reflect on what's next. And we both believe that there is a clear need for conceptual clarity, or more conceptual clarity, around key notions such as embodiment, even creativity, constraints. In our view, possibility studies are an inspiring body of research to do so. And despite growing interest, research is still limited, particularly on how movement supports musicians' creativity and how instrumental or vocal teachers can use their body to foster creative learning. This points to an emerging and largely unexplored line of inquiry with important implications for translating embodied perspectives into everyday pedagogical practice. And so we do arrive at the final slide. We want to wrap it up by connecting the two main threads of the talk. Pedagogies of the possible ask us to move beyond what music education was and is, and to imagine what it can become. We believe that music pedagogy, embodied music pedagogy, offers a concrete way to do this. By grounding music learning and teaching in bodily engagement and exploration, embodied music pedagogy makes the possible not only thinkable, but actually felt and experienced. And in this way, creativity becomes something that emerges in the moment, in the relations between students, teachers, materials, instruments, spaces, and sounds. And so we see embodied music pedagogy as an operationalization of pedagogies of the possible, a pedagogy that opens up new futures for music education, futures that are flexible, inclusive, imaginative, and fundamentally human. If you want to follow our work, you can do this here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luke and Melissa, for this fascinating lecture. There is always something magical about music, and I think that you have brought a lot of magic today. So thank you so much. We have some time for discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand in Zoom, or you can also type the question in the chat, and then we can just read it aloud. And so let me see if we have.
Yes, I wanted to ask you to remove the PowerPoint so you get to see some faces.
Yes. So we have a question from Penny. Please, Penny, go ahead.
Sorry, my laptop's melting here. Not the heat in the UK, just from overuse. I have actually just typed it in the chat because I'm hosting a meeting at 5, so I have to go. But so you can see that I don't know whether you. By the way, thank you. That was brilliant and really interesting, and lots of overlaps with our work here, especially with our project Forest of Imagination. But I put in the chat, you can see. How can this approach be adapted and applied across the whole curriculum? And would it be then a kinesthetic approach? Because you talked about the link with, I can't remember your phrase now, but around kinemusic and transdisciplinary inquiry. So yes, our work is embodied and creative and relational, but how then would you, I suppose my question around trying to change the curriculum here in the UK is how would you then see that manifested across different disciplines?
I think it's a very interesting question. At the moment, we're doing research into how you can combine music with more societal themes. For example, on nature, we are giving students the assignment to make a farewell song for a dying animal, for example, for somebody who's dying. And what you can see is that that really is transdisciplinary because they have to take the perspective of the animal that is dying. It's kind of a heavy topic. You would not do this in a kindergarten, of course, because everybody would be traumatized. But then they actually go out into nature and they make sound recordings and they integrate it with all live music. So I think that is a way actually to work far more transdisciplinary. But I think it's quite unusual for music education to take topics outside the area of music and to integrate it within music education. It's usually very much geared towards music itself. But I think this approach that we're researching is very promising.
Thank you. I'm sorry I have to disappear, but thank you everyone. Always good to be here. See you soon.
Okay, so we have a question from Aileen.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for that wonderful presentation. I do a lot of work with music and arts therapy organizations, and I'm very curious about whether you've looked at kind of how this EMP approach could be used in special education or therapeutic communities and environments.
That's a question for Melissa, I think.
Well, actually, I think it's a great question for the work that Georgia is doing.
Yeah, also.
So you could explain that. I think that connects beautifully to her work.
Yeah, Georgia is one of my PhD students. She works with refugees. It's not really special education as you would say. But she works with refugees. I use the approach also in working with children with a migrant background, and we use it in Poland with children who are social orphans. So and there for me, what I see is that you move away from certain practices, let's say, that are often not experienced as accessible in some way. And so because, for example, you move away from repertoire and you really go to how do you express yourself through sound, music. We don't even always have to say music. You know, you talk about sounds sometimes and what they can do. Rap on your clarinet, for example, is a thing that seems strange, but not. It is actually not. It would be in a music school, traditional music school, this would sound strange. But so you can go to it. Actually, it makes you think in a different way about what is music. And this is for me a very important question. What is music? And from the moment you think differently of what music can be, you allow these different approaches. Yes. And so it would be fantastic, I think, to link this approach, for example, to the sounds of intent system, which is a fantastic framework. Yes, where you could, if you make the combination, perhaps something to do in the future would be really great. So yes, I think we haven't explored that very much actually, because you know we're in the developing phase. But I think it would be very interesting to do that. Yes, absolutely. Go
Thank
to
you.
special education.
Adding on that, Luc, we have done some research on the multimodal teaching approach for children, students who are severely disabled. And there we work a lot with materials and with haptic touch as well, with haptic feedback, where we use materials to really provide students with a deeper sense of the meaning of music. But we also work with visuals and with smell, for example, to give all kinds of different sensory experiences that surround music, to really include the bodily experience. So we've written an article about it. I can put it in the chat in a minute.
Oh, I would love that. Thank you so much, because I was struck by so many similarities of what we do in music and arts therapy. And I work with adults, basically. We have nonverbal adults. We have adults who have profound physical challenges. And one of the things that just never ceases to amaze me is when we bring music, as well as art, but since we're talking about music today, when we bring music into this, whether it's through the body or just what happens when the sound happens. We even have some nonverbal participants who, when there is music involved, they will vocalize, whether they are using words or sound or whatever. So between the body as well as the sounds, it's just incredible what happens.
Yes, I totally agree, and I will put the open access article in the chat. I think it's open access. I'm not quite sure actually, but otherwise, give me an email and I will send it to you.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions? Or yes, Alison, please.
Hello. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that immensely. Sorry, I was a little bit late in arriving. If what you say is right, that that being musical is a very complex way of being, a sort of meta-stable way of being, and you're encouraging children to be actively musical, which is wonderful. You also say that more research needs to be done about, for example, how movement stimulates musicians' creativity. Can you take being musical to your research approach? Can you walk the walk and sing and talk the talk, as it were? So if you, sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, but can you be musical in your research approach? Can you take a musical structure, for example, to your musical research, to your research? Be absolutely musical in your research. Take music as the way of being in your research. Would that work for you?
It's a very nice question. If you bring it to complexity, for example, and to different layers, as we find in structure in music, I would say yes. For example, in the way you when you do research and you have to deal with methodologies, for example, I think this is a very beautiful example of where you can have this allow complexity, allow complexity, but still try to find within that complexity some structures, to find new things through methodologies. Actually, methodologies can also bring in these constraints. Yes. So being creative with different types of methodologies, I think, is one way of being musical in research.
Yeah, and I also think when I'm writing a findings sections, you have all these different voices that you want to compose together, and you want sometimes highlight one voice and then soften another voice. I think actually it's very much about composing such a way that all the voices can be heard. So I think for me, that is a very musical process. And I come from a Javanese gamelan background where all the voices really interconnect to really kind of make the whole. So I think, yes, I do think with in all these aspects, it can be very musical. Yes.
I look forward to the symphonic article then. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good question. Thank you.
Yes, Hans, please.
Oh, a well-known person to us.
Hi, yes, Melissa and Luc. So nice to meet again.
Lovely.
After, it's some months ago that we met in Antwerp. So
the last time was on a beach, I think.
On a beach. Don't talk about that. But okay, so nice to always to hear your about your work again. You know, I'm rather acquainted with your work. I'm very fond of your work. But I have also a critical question, or maybe a critical remark. Something that I missed now, and maybe it has been a deliberate choice of you, because there are so many facets to music, you have to make choices. But it's the communicative aspect. So, and in the examples that you gave also, it often felt to me like you were talking about music that was whether something that was outside, coming from the outside, or whether that it was something that came from the individual who would be creating music. But there's also this aspect of, all musicians say music is communication. When you say music is communication, music is communication. And then they go on with their work and teaching with music as being not communication, and talking about music and reproducing existing music and so on. So for me, I think this communicative aspect is a very essential one, a very central one also, and also from an evolutionary perspective, probably. So yeah, it's also so connected to the embodied experience of music. So I found it a little bit strange that it was not explicitly mentioned. So you have been talking about social aspects and so on, but not very explicitly. But maybe it was a deliberate choice.
Hans, we have to make choices, as you say. I think if you say that you know the work, you know that it's in there. Because, for example, let me talk about the kinesiological approach, for example. From the very first sound even you make on your instrument, and can be a squeak, by the way, yes, on the clarinet, yes. It is about communication. It is always about expressing something to somebody else. And it is in evolving together in the way you express to each other by making music together. That's, for example, why in a kinesiological approach, it would never be a one-to-one lesson. Although it can happen between teacher and student in a one-to-one also. We have to say that. But I prefer to work in little groups where you do a lot of, it's all the time communication. Yeah. To give you a concrete example, imagine that we bring in constraints, a rope. And one student handles a rope and the other student, so it's in pairs, yes, another student plays to that. Now, perhaps they don't play both, but they are communicating in a very intense way, in a very intense way. Moreover, you have to respect each other. This is also something we do not highlight in this talk, but it's very important to learn how to respect each other and value each other's way of expressing themselves. So when I do stuff with my rope to you, Hans, and I do too crazy stuff with your violin, yes,
Don't
I
touch my
should,
violin.
I should respect you and what you can do, because I know that afterwards you'll do it to me. You know, and so also that is an aspect of this communication all the time. So it is there. This relational aspect between people, it's always there. You know, we call it participatory sense making, for example.
Yeah. Anyway, I could see it in some of the drawings or the photos that people were interacting, but you didn't mention it explicitly. So I just wanted to ask. Okay.
Yeah, so in our theory, we have a whole a topic on participatory sense making. So I think you can just go back to the work and check it out. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans.
Okay, Vlad, please.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, guys. Big congratulations on this. I mean, so much food for thought. I was thinking about this question, what is music? You know, and I think the other question is what is possibility when you look at it through the lens of music, and then what is education? But we're not getting into all of them together. But I'm really fascinated with, you know, the way you brought in the body and perspectives, and basically was thinking here about music as a medium that teaches you, you know, as we're talking about much more than music itself. And we started at the beginning, we're making some jokes about noise, or at least I was saying music noise. But to me, you know, one of the things that fascinates me, and you capture very well in your big idea, big framework, is the idea that music is rhythm. It is something that fundamentally talks almost about movement. I mean, there is a movement of sound waves, there is a movement of the body and within the body. There is a social movement, as we were saying right now. So I think it brings, you know, to me very interestingly, this dimension of our existence that is embodied and emotional that, again, at least in psychology, we don't often talk about. So one curiosity I had, and this is coming back to what I was telling you, that together with other colleagues, we're looking at possibility thinking, possibilities literacy, and music in the future is kind of how do we educate with music and through music? And I mean education not only in schools, obviously lifelong, right, and life-wide, in areas that are, you know, deeply interesting for possibility, which connect to diversity, multiplicity of perspectives, even ethics. I mean, I can see that the learnings that one gets from these experiences could be generalized, could travel, you know, could be transferred. So without, you know, hijacking with this idea of possibilities literacy, but with colleagues, we're working on a framework that I'm happy to share, but some of you might know because you might have heard me in the recent conference, that looks across, you know, becoming aware of possibilities, exploring them, engaging with others, choosing ethically, and kind of developing mindsets for. So I think everything you said kind of addresses a lot of that. So long story short, I'm almost thinking, how can this idea be taken even further? And you already mentioned a lot of different audiences, and your students work with very interesting groups. Music and the teaching even beyond music, or the music with like capital M, maybe the small m, that is really part of everything, including the musicality of our voice.
Yeah.
Big question here. But thank you. Thanks for the talk.
Thank you. Yes, it's always interesting to think about how you can go beyond also the music. It's by coincidence today I was working with my students and I asked them to analyze a score. So future teacher, and I asked them to analyze the score, and try to find affordances in the score. It was crazy to see how they're kind of stuck in some ways of looking, actually. But you could do the same with language. I think you could do the same with when you draw or when you paint or when you look at a painting. So many things is the same principle behind it, actually. It's the way we look at it. There is this painter in Belgium, I always forget his name. Perhaps Hans can help me. He paints these boxers, Hans. And he has this fantastic documentary on the waanzin the waanzin van het detail. How do you translate that? Hans, Melissa, help me. The craziness of the detail. And in that documentary, he talks about a 3. He says, people are walking in the park and they pass a tree. What do they see? And it's always the same. They see the structure, but not all the shades of green, the different colors in there, the chaos in the branches. I think perhaps what you talk about, Vlad, is that it's a way of how we are in the world and look at everything that is in the world, and how we not just look but connect to it. Because if I in some way feel the movement in the little branches and how that changes everything in the tree, that is seeing possibilities of how things can transform. So I think it all comes down to the same, where in whatever domain it is about this openness, perceptiveness, or I don't know how you have to call it, but yeah, seeing things.
I think it's a way of being, isn't it? Sorry. Going to add, Lisa?
Yes, I think music can actually add to that because it really makes the body very sensitive, and I think it's very interesting that you have this idea of the hierarchies of the senses, that in the Western world we are so focused on the visual and we forget the touch and the sound. And I think this is what music has to offer beyond music itself. It can really make you far more perceptive and sensitive in a different way than other subjects can do.
Yes, I just also wanted to comment very shortly. This way of being in the world, this wonderful way, is also seeing ethics. It's also an ethical attitude of attention and love and care for the world. So it's a wonderful combination. And I think that somebody had their hand raised. I'm not sure. Probably Hans. Hans, right? Yes. Hans, please go.
Yes,
go ahead.
thank you. Well, I wanted to add to that, Melissa and Luc, that music and music education, maybe especially, doesn't provide for that kind of being in the world under all conditions. It very much depends how it is being taught.
I totally agree.
Because sometimes it undermines even.
Yes, but that I think counts for a lot of things that we learn in school, not only music. But indeed, just for maybe people will recognize this idea of school music, where it's always highly reproductive. You have to sit down, you have to be disciplined, you have to imitate the teacher. I guess we're not talking about that kind of music education. I agree, Hans, I can see your point.
Yeah. And yet I want to add something in the sense that, we have all these ideas of how to do it and what we see as even saying, not as it was or as it is, but as it can be or should be. Yes. And we always have to be careful, I think, in being proselytic, or I don't know how you call it. That's why when I'm so enthusiastic about using movement, I always show my students this little part of that poet society where the guy, when they're walking around on the square and the teacher asks, "Hey, why aren't you joining us?" And he says, "Exercising the right not to walk, sir." And this is like an extremely important thing because, this is really going to the child and the learner, the pupil, that their voice is what counts, even if they don't want to do it. And I think that's an important one. So it's also the teacher's right not to want to do that.
I think we have a very nice functional question. Welcome, Christina. It's great sometimes to go from this very high meta to very functional. I think, Luc, this is something for you.
I have more functional about enhancing about my work with that are more static for great. Oh my God.
That's what I thought.
Yes, this is really great. For example, let me start easy. Okay, let's take a bass, string bass, or let's take the cello. Yes, we would not think that we go and walk around with that or dance with it and move with it. Yeah, well, it's wonderful when you do it. So I give these workshops in kinesiological approach to orchestras, for example, and the basses are doing it, but, and this is a nice thing, they have to negotiate with the possibilities of their instrument. And this is what I like so much. So yes, they can perhaps not walk around all the time, although a cellist can. And even when you go back in history, cellists did. They just had a hole in the back of the cello with something up and around the neck. So they actually did. Only perhaps we forgot. Think about the piano. When we think about piano playing, we have this almost fixed idea of how you have to sit at a piano. You know, on the two things, you know, where you have, you know, the two bubbles, or I don't know how you call them, but you have to sit and you have to sit straight, you know, and the hand and so on. So we all have this idea of how to play the piano. But why? Why wouldn't you be able to, at some points in a lesson, just stand behind the piano and start doing a stepping exercise? It's possible. I did it. Yes. So it's possible. But sometimes it's going out, but still evidently taking into account the limitations we have. But that's the beauty of it, I think, is like dealing with those constraints.
So, Christina, I hope you're convinced.
Yes, I'm in the process of. I'm a harpist, so it has been sometimes a disappointment to see all my. Sorry, my son is making noise around here. I don't know if you can hear it, but yeah, I have a lot of friends in the orchestras, and they're so nicely free walking around. I'm like, oh, I could do that. I'm so stuck between a very heavy instrument. But yeah, it's nice to experiment with new things. I'm going to try the stepping exercise tomorrow.
Great.
And then see if my students can do something like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a wonderful discussion. I don't know, maybe, well, we are almost at the time, but if somebody else would like to ask a question, maybe just one last question. Yes.
Somebody has to leave.
Yes. Okay, so then just to thank you once again for this brilliant, fascinating, magical lecture and discussion. And just a very quick reminder that every week we have also exciting seminars and forums taking place. So you're all welcome to join. You can find more information on the Possibility Studies Network. And a very big thank you to all of you.
It was a really up there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening. Thanks.
You too all. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.